Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining me today in this JavaScript for Beginner workshop. So I'm just going to start by introducing CodeLabs Academy and what we do. So CodeLabs Academy is a new learning platform and coding school that offers bootcamp in a wide range of subjects such as data science, web development, UX UI design, and cybersecurity. All the bootcamps have flexible schedules and are paired with one-on-one career coaching from industry professionals. So if you are interested in starting a new career in tech or maybe switching into a new field, head over to codelabsacademy.com and check out our upcoming sessions. All right, so I think we can start with the workshop. So today's workshop is about JavaScript. So we'll try to do a brief introduction of JavaScript, so we'll be able to have a good and fundamental understanding. And in upcoming workshops, we will try to have a deep dive into more advanced subject. So for now, this workshop will be targeted at beginners. We will start from basic subjects and try to move our way into more advanced or intermediate subjects. Okay, so the way we'll be working today is I have the slides right here where I will introduce the concept that we'll see today. I will also use the notepad right here. So it's just an interactive tool that will allow us to test our code as we go, and we can try and experiment with the example right here. Okay, so let's get started. So like I said, today we'll just try to cover the fundamentals. These are the most important concepts that you should be, or actually you should be familiar with if you want to program in JavaScript. So what we will try to cover today is variables, data types, arithmetic operations, and conditional statements. We'll also get a look at loops and functions, and finally arrays and objects. Okay, but before we start, just wanted to give a brief definition of what is JavaScript. So basically, JavaScript is a scripting programming language that was created in the 90s. It constitutes the third layer of any web page. So we have three layers that constitute any or normally any web page. We have HTML. So HTML is the backbone of the web page. It defines the general structure and the hierarchy of the page. We also have CSS. So CSS is more concerned with the styling, meaning the styling and customizing animations, colors, fonts. And the third and final layer is JavaScript, as we mentioned. So JavaScript is used to add the complex interaction that happen at the level of the browser. We can give a few examples. For instance, let's think of, for example, a user that inputs information into a form. We handle the inputted data and we send the result to our server. We also can work with complex animations that cannot be handled just by CSS. Also navigating between pages and keeping track of the state of the application. All this can be considered use cases of JavaScript. JavaScript is usually found in all the web pages on the web. Its use is widely spread due to it being the only programming language that's understandable by the browser. So yeah, so learning JavaScript effectively opens the door for mastering the web development at large. Just to reiterate, so I have some JavaScript use cases right here. So like we said, to add an interactivity to a web page. So static web pages, meaning the pages that are only built with HTML and CSS don't or cannot be used for interactive purposes. So to do that, we have to include JavaScript. Also creating web and mobile applications. So the distinction right here is that JavaScript is a language that can be both used on the front end and the back end of an application. So effectively, learning or using JavaScript will allow us to build applications or fully fledged applications from the front end into the back end. Also building server-side applications, so that goes into the second idea. We can also build browser games. This is particularly useful, or it's actually a use case of JavaScript, since due to its nature of accessing the capabilities of the browser. So this particularity allows us to build games that are usually more performance demanding than normal applications. Alright, so moving on. Why use JavaScript? So like we mentioned, JavaScript is only the only programming language understandable by the browser. We also have the popularity point. So JavaScript is usually or consistently ranking amongst the first languages in the surveys that are done by developers to developers. So it's one of the languages that is the most popular and also the most loved by the community. It also can be considered beginner friendly. Obviously, there are a lot of features and a lot of things that can be done with JavaScript, but knowing the fundamentals will allow us to build applications. And it's also fun to learn. So like I said, there are a lot of features, so a lot of things to learn, and we won't get bored by learning JavaScript. Alright, so we did the introduction. Let's get started with JavaScript fundamentals. So the first concept we'll try to talk about is variables. So what are variables? Let's just think of variables as an entity that can detain values, different values. So it's basically we have values in our program. We want to keep track of those values, so we keep them in variable. So variable can just be like considered as a box that keep our values, and along the program we can interact with our values by referencing the variables. In any program that you will find, it's particularly hard to just write the whole program without variables, since we have to reference the values each time. So it will be easier to use variables, and also the naming convention of variables, if done right, can help us actually write readable code. So in JavaScript specifically, we have three ways to declare and use variables. So we have the old style variable declaration with the keyword var. So it's var and then the name of the variable, and then we can give it a value. We initialize the value. In this example, it's 5. And then for us to see the variable, we use console.log. So we'll see that in the example in a few minutes. We also have the new style variable declaration. So it's let and then the name of the variable and then the initialization. So we give it the value 12. We also have the constant declaration with the keyword const and then the name of the constant and then the initialization value. So the difference between let and const is let is a variable. So by its name, it can carry different values, and we can change it once we initialize it. But it's not the case with the constant. So the constant can only keep one value and it cannot change. So let's do a few examples. Let's take, for example, a variable, name it age, and give it the value 30. We can see the variable with console.log. And by the way, console.log is used to check the state of the program at any point of time. It's particularly useful if we want to debug our program. Debugging just means that we want to identify the issues that we have in our program to try to solve them. So you will see that we use console.log heavily. So like I said, with the keyword let and then the name of the variable and then the initialization, the distinction of variable is that they can change in value over time. So for example, age, we can change it to 25 and console.log age again. And as expected, we'll get 30 and then 25. It's not the case with constants, so they only keep values that won't change with the flow of our program. Just to give an example, so it basically operates in the same manner. and it will give us an error if we try to change the value of a constant. Also, one thing that I didn't talk about is we can actually just declare a variable and then give it a value later. So that would work normally. And yeah, so that's about it for variables. So just as a recap, there are 3 ways to declare a variable, or actually 2 ways, and the third one is for constants. So there is the old style variable declaration. You will find it in old code bases. It's not actually used right now, so it's preferable to use let when declaring variables. So we have the var for old style variable declarations, the let keyword for new style variable declaration, and the const for declaring constants. We can declare a variable and then assign to it a value, or we can initialize it with a value and then change it later. Okay, moving on. So now we will talk about data types. So data types is one of the subjects that changes a lot between a programming language and another. For JavaScript specifically, here are the data types that you will see more often. So there is the number. The number data type I just would like to define what do we mean by data type. So data type is just the set of values that can be assigned to a variable. So for example, number is all the numbers that are possible. In JavaScript specifically, we don't have a distinction between numbers that are positive and negative, so they all fall under the number data type. One distinction, although, is the big int. So big int is used for extremely large numbers. It's not a common use case, and the difference between a big int and a number is, I think, at the threshold of 2 to the power of 53. So above that, it is considered big int. So if you are dealing with extremely large number, you should use the big int rather than the number. We also have the string. So the string is a set of characters that are concatenated. The first one is an empty string. Sorry, so there is no character right here. John is a string that contains these characters, G, H, O, and N, and the same goes for do. So this is the string data type. We also have the Boolean. So the Boolean can only take 2 values, true and false. Boolean is particularly useful when we want to evaluate expressions and we want to define statements and then use particular condition depending on the value of that statement. For example, we can have a condition that either evaluates to true, and then we execute a certain set of instruction in our program, and if it evaluates to false, we execute different set of instructions. So Boolean is a useful data type for controlling the flow of our program, as we will see a little bit later. We also have the null. So null is used for unknown values, and we have undefined that is used for unassigned values. So it's not really clear what's the difference between null and undefined. So as a rule of thumb, null is used for actually undefined is used for the values that are not assigned. So generally speaking, where we have like an error in our program or unexpected behavior, and null can be used to actually to a certain degree as same as Boolean to evaluate expressions. So we can evaluate a certain expression that if it equals to null, we can do a certain we can execute a certain set of instructions, and if it doesn't evaluate to null, so it's a valid value, we do a different set of instructions. We also have the object and the symbol that we will cover a little bit later. Actually, symbols, we won't be able to cover them today, since it's more of an advanced subject. But object is just, as the word suggests, is just a term for an object is just a set of values that are bundled together, and that they mean that they carry the same logical meanings. So we want to keep them together in order to manipulate them in our program. Okay, so this was a brief introduction into the data types in JavaScript. So just to recap, we have the number. The number data type contains all the numbers whether they are positive, negative, and in other programming languages, these type of values are named float, but in JavaScript they all fall under the number data type. We have the big int for extremely large number, a string for a set of characters that are concatenated together. We have booleans for true or false, null for unknown values, and undefined for unassigned values. Also have object and symbols. So in order for us to get the type of a variable, we can use the type of method. So we just pass in the variable and it will give us the type of that variable. Let's just give it a try right here. So let's keep the same example as earlier. We have a variable age, assign it the value 30. And then we want to get the type of the variable age. So we just do type of, and then we pass in age, and we should be getting number. And yeah, as expected, we get the type, the data type number corresponding to the value 30, carried by the variable age. So if we want to change, for example, name, John. Since John is a set of characters that are concatenated, we should be getting a string. And we get a string for the data type name. We can also do a boolean. So the boolean is either true or false. Let's just change the name to exists. And we get the boolean type. So this is the method, just as a recap. So type of is the method that we use to get the type of the data type of a certain variable. Moving on. So now we talk about arithmetic operations. So arithmetic operations are the same, are used in the same sense that are used in the mathematical term. So they are just a set of instructions that we use to manipulate the values in our program. The arithmetic operations in JavaScript are the addition, the subtraction, the multiplication, the division, the remainder, and then the exponentiation. So you will find that in our program we interact a lot with values, and we do a lot of computation. So these arithmetic operations are critical in the general flow of many programs. So let's just do some examples. So the use of arithmetic operation is pretty straightforward. We have here 2 plus 3, which give us 5. We'll do the same thing with the rest of the operations. So here is a subtraction, multiplication, a division, and then a remainder. And finally we have the exponentiation. So these are the expected result for each of these operations. Other distinctions in the arithmetic operation is, or actually ones that we use quite often are when we want to increment a value. So for example, let's declare a variable with the name number and give it the value 20. So we can directly do number is equal to number plus 1 to increment the value. But there is also this abbreviation, so number plus plus. Basically operates in the same fashion, it just increment the value. Sorry. In this case specifically it didn't. Why? Because when we do the plus plus after the number, it will actually execute this function, the console.log, and then increment the value. So if we want to increment the value before we execute the function, we just do plus plus before the variable, and hopefully we get 21. And we get 21. You will find that we use a lot we use this notation a lot when we, as we will see a little bit later, in loops. So I think that's about it for arithmetic operations. Just to recap, we have these type of operations. We have the addition, the standard subtraction, the standard multiplication. Also for the division, the remainder. The remainder is actually the rest of normal division. The exponentiation is the same as the mathematical exponentiation. Okay. So now we have conditional statements. Conditional statements are actually one of the most important concepts in defining any logical program. So what do we mean by conditional statements? So in our program, we want to control the flow of the instructions that we want to execute. But at certain points in our program, we want to change the set of instructions that gets executed depending on the values that we got from previous instructions. So this is the most basic example of a conditional statement. We have this syntax, if and then the condition that gets evaluated, and then we open a code block with these curly braces. Inside the curly braces, we have the code block that will be executed if the condition is met. So execute code if condition is true. So inside this one condition, we have an expression like we mentioned earlier. We can evaluate this expression into true or false, and depending on these two values, we decide to execute the set of instructions inside the code block, or we just effectively skip those instructions. So if condition is evaluated to true, we execute the code inside the curly braces. If it evaluates to false, we just skip this code and move to the rest of the program. We also have the if-else statement. So if-else statement is used to account for both cases, meaning if the condition evaluates to true and if the condition evaluates to false. So if the condition evaluates to true, we have this code block that will be executed, and then we skip to the end of the conditional statement. If the condition evaluates to false, we skip this one and we only execute the code blocks inside the curly braces of after the else, meaning we execute the code if condition is false. So this is just a way for us to define the set of instructions that will be executed depending on the value that we will get from condition or from evaluating the condition. We also have multiple if-else statements. So this is in the case where we have not just one condition but many conditions that we want to evaluate. So it follows somewhat the same logic. So we have the first condition. If it's true, we execute the code inside the code block. So it's basically the same thing as earlier. If it's not the case, meaning that the condition 1 evaluates to false, we check for a second condition rather than just executing the code for all cases where condition is false. So we have another condition, condition 2. We execute the code if condition 1 is false and condition 2 is true. And same goes for condition 3. So we execute the code if both condition 1 and 2 are false and condition 3 is true. And finally, we have the final else. The final else is executed only if all the previous conditions are false. So execute code if all previous conditions are false. It's basically a way for us to just check for the case where all our previous conditions were not met, and we do our final and we execute our final code block. So as you may have noticed, this is not like a good or actually a comprehensive way of doing things. We can separate each condition, but you might find that there are use cases where this is or actually this is the best way to do it. So just to evaluate each condition after the other. In other cases where this might not make sense, we have the switch statement. So the switch statement is a little bit different in at the level of the condition. So the condition in the switch statement cannot just be evaluated to true or false. It can take any value. And we account for the values that the expression can take, and for each one we define a case statement. So if the expression is equal to that specific case, the code block of that case will be executed. In our example right here, we have an expression case where the expression is equal to if x is equal to expression, we execute this code, and then we break. Break just means that we'll skip the rest of the cases and we will go execute the rest of the program after the switch statement. And then same goes for the other conditions. So it's only if naturally the expression can only be equal to one value, so only one case will be executed. And if all our cases do not account for the value in expression, meaning that expression is not equal to x, not equal to y, not equal to z, we execute the default statement. The default statement works as the same way as the else statement works here. So the default statement execute code if expression is different from all previous cases. So this is generally speaking the examples we have in the conditional statements in JavaScript. There are others, but these three are the main one that we will use. So just to recap, we have the basic case where we have just one condition. The condition may evaluate to true or false. If it evaluates to true, we execute the code inside the curly braces of the if. If it's not the case, we just skip this code. For if else, it operates in the same fashion. So the condition, if it evaluates to true, we execute this code block. If it evaluates to false, we execute this code block. Extending on that concept, we have the multiple else if statements. So we have the difference right here is that we have different conditions, and each time we evaluate on that current condition. So condition 1 is true, condition 2 is true, and the previous conditions are false. And finally we have else, which account for the case where not one of the conditions, the previous conditions are evaluated to true. Finally, we have the switch statement. So the switch statement accounts for expressions and not conditions. Expressions can take any value, whereas conditions can only take true or false. We define a case for each expected value that expression may take. So for example, x, y, and z. If expression equals to one of the defined case, the code corresponded will be executed, and then we break. We break meaning that we go in execute the rest of the program after the switch statement. If neither one of the cases that we defined earlier satisfies the expression, we execute the default case. The default case will be executed if all the previous values are different from the expression. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for conditions. Let's just give a few examples. So let's define a variable age and give it the value 30. Let's do a simple condition. If age is greater than 40, we just execute a simple code saying that age is greater than 40. In our case specifically, we see that the age is not greater than 40, so this code will not be executed. We'll directly skip this code and go to the rest of the program right here. Of the program. This line just represents the rest of the set of instructions that we will normally have in our program. So when we execute, the normal flow is that we evaluate this expression to false, since 30 is not greater than 40. So this condition block will not be executed, and we will skip it to go to the rest of our program. if we change our value to 50 to effectively evaluate this condition into true, we will get both the condition block being executed and then the rest of the program. And yeah, as expected, we get age is greater than 40 and then the rest of the program. We can also do an if-else statement. So console log. This else will be executed if the case where the age is not greater than 40. So is not, or can do is lesser than 40. So in this case, either one of these code will be executed. In our case, 50 is greater than 40, so this one will be executed. Let's change it again to 20. So this sorry, this condition will be evaluated to false since 20 is not greater than 40, and then we will execute this code right here, and then the rest of the program. Yeah, and we get the expected behavior. So I'm trying to think of a good example where we can use the multiple else if statement. So okay, let's imagine a scenario where we have a write a program that checks if a number is a multiplier of 2, 4, and let's do 2, 4, and then 16, for example. So effectively, how can we do this in using the else if conditional statement? Is that we first evaluate the condition that if the number is a multiplier of 16. If it's the case, we just print that the number is in fact a multiplier of 16. If it's not the case, we check the next condition, which is 4. If it's a multiplier of 4, we just print that the number is a multiplier of 4. And if it's not the case, we just check the last condition. If the last condition is also false, we do at the final else statement, we can just say that the number is not a multiplier of any of the previously defined number. So we can do that. If let's take a number as an example, 126 maybe. So first, if number is a multiplier of 16, how can we check if a number is a multiplier of another number? We can use the remainder. Remainder is the arithmetic operation that we used earlier. If the number is and then we can check if the value is equal to 0. So this means that the rest of the division of the number by 16 will be 0, which effectively means that the number is a multiplier of 16. This syntax, by the way, is the double equals, just mean that we check if the condition at the left equals the condition at the right. So it just means that the remainder of the division by 16 is equal to 0. And then we can just say console.log number is a multiple, or actually a multiple, sorry, of 16. If it's not the case, we do we check with 4. So if remainder of the number by 4 is equal to 0, the same thing. So 4, we have the else if for to account for the case of 2. And the final else is just to check for the case where the specified number doesn't satisfy any of the previous conditions. Okay, so let's test this program for the value 126. So we get a number is a multiple of 2. So let's try to get the behavior of this code. Sorry. The first one, we check the condition if the number is a multiple of 16. 126 is not a multiple of 16, so we skip this code block, meaning that the number is not a multiple of 16. Next, we check for the next condition, which is if the number is a multiple of 4. It's not the case, so we skip also this code block. And then finally we reach the point where we check for 126. Is it a multiple of 2? We see that it's true, and then we print number is a multiple of 2. And then we skip to the rest of the program. So we don't execute this final else statement. I think that's about it for multiple else if statements. We can do something similar in a switch statement. So let's keep the number and do maybe, let's think of an example, a different example, maybe colors. So we have the color white, and then let's try a switch statement that checks for the different colors. Switch color. We define the case where the color is maybe red. So .log color is red, and then we do the break keyword. Case where the color is blue. And then the break statement, or the break keyword, sorry. And then let's just not use a case for white, let's just do directly default. Is not any of the previously defined colors. Or is different. And let's do the final break. Let's execute this code, and we get color is different from the previously defined colors. So it will effectively work as a similar fashion as the previous example. But this one, we don't evaluate the expression or the condition as true or false. We evaluate it by value, per value. So we check for the previous, the first case where the color is red. So the colors are different. So we skip this case. Same things go for the case of the color blue. And since it's not a case that we defined, we just default to the final case, which is the default case. And then we just print color is different from the previously defined colors. If we do a specific one for white, and as expected we get the color white, because this case statement corresponds to the value of color. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the conditional statement. Obviously, we'll go through other conditional statement in the upcoming examples. But as a general rule, these are the condition statement that we'll see. I hope you understand it. Okay, so now we move on to loops. So the basic loop. So what are loops? Loops are basically a way for us to let's just imagine that we have a different or multiple we have a set of instructions that we need to execute on many inputs. For example, we want to divide a number by 2, but we have a list of numbers, maybe 100 number that we want to get. For each number, we want to divide that number by 2. What we can do is we can write the code to divide a number by 2 100 times, but that wouldn't be efficient since it doesn't make sense. It's the same logic, just repeated for each number. So rather than doing that, you can use the loop. So basically, a loop is a way for us to execute the same code, the same logic, just a defined number of times, with only changing the variables that we are operating or inputting in each iteration. So this is the basic syntax for a for loop. It's not really complicated. So we have the for keyword, and then we have 3 components. So the first component is just declaring a variable I. So I is short for index or indices. It's just the value that we'll be able to access inside the for loop, and it will tell us at which iteration we are in our for loop. So we initialize it at 0. After that, we have the exit condition. The exit condition right here is if I is strictly smaller than 10. So if this condition evaluates to false, we'll break from the loop. Effectively, what it means is that we'll execute this code inside the for loop until this condition is no longer valid. It will be when it will be false. And each time, at each iteration, the final component right here is I++. We saw that earlier. It just means that we will increment the variable I, meaning that at each end of iteration we will execute this one. At each end of iteration, I will be incremented. So effectively, what does this mean? It means that the code block right here will be executed 10 times. We'll increment I each time, and at the final iteration, when I reaches 10, so 10 is not strictly smaller than 10, which means that this condition will evaluate to false and effectively break us from the for loop. Let's try to do an example. Just gonna remove this code. Like I said, we have let's say, for example, we just want to print the numbers from 0 to 9. So we do the for loop. So for keyword, and then let I equals to 0. It is initialized to 0. The exit condition will be I is strictly smaller than 10. And each time we increment I by 1. And we just console log I. So I is the index that will be incremented at each iteration of the for loop. At first it will be 0, and then at the end of this iteration, we may imagine that we have many other instructions inside the for loop. It will be incremented to 1. Of course, each time we check for the condition, the exit condition. So 1 is also strictly smaller than 10. So we keep going until we reach until I reaches the value 10. In that case, I will not be strictly smaller than, or 10 is not strictly smaller than 10, and then we will break out from the loop. And then we'll execute the rest of the code. And as expected, we get the values of I. So the first one is 0, 1, 2, 3, until we reach 9. When we reach 9, actually I gets incremented once again, so it will be 10, but we won't execute this code block since we reached the exit condition. And then we execute the rest of the program. Just to give a use case where this will be particularly useful. For example, if you want to get the multiple by 2 of each of these numbers, we can do it by using a loop, or we can effectively do it without a loop, each time repeating the same operation. So 0 multiplied by 2. And then it just means that we will repeat our code 10 times. In this specific use case, it's not really a problem since it's just a simple operation, which is multiplying two numbers. But let's just imagine that in real world scenarios where each of our set of instructions may be like 30 lines of code, maybe 40 lines of code, maybe a complex logic, it wouldn't make sense for us to repeat it that many times. Just write it once and use it on each of the iterations. Alright, I hope that's clear. So we'll move to functions. So functions is actually a really intuitive concept. So a function is a way for us to bundle a set of instructions together. And let's just imagine that we have a set of instructions that we use quite often in our program, in many different files or in many different places. It wouldn't make sense for us to, each time when we need those sets of instructions together, we just copy and paste those sets of instructions again and again, since it's the same logic. Let's just imagine that for these sets of instructions specifically, you want to change something, maybe a line or two. In that case, we will have to change those lines in each of the times where we copied that code. So it's counterproductive. Rather than that, what we can do is we define a set of those sets of instructions as a function. This function will bundle these set of instructions. We'll give that function a name. And each time we need those set of instructions, we can just reference the name of that function rather than recalling all those set of instructions. Also, in this case, in the previous example, when we want to change something, we directly change it at the level of the code of that specific function. And it will reduce our workload. So this is the structure of a function in JavaScript. We have the keyword function. First, before we use a function, we have to define it. So we have the keyword and then the name of the function. A function takes in parameters. It can take 0 or 1, 2, or 3, or many other parameters. It depends on our use case. Here specifically, I just chose 3 parameters. Inside the function, we have a set of instructions. At the end of those set of instructions, we return a value. Once we define a function, we can call that function any number of times. We just pass in the values of that function. So here actually a slight distinction in naming. So when we define the function, we call these parameters. And when we call the function, we name these arguments. So arguments are the actual values that we pass to each instance of that function, and the parameters are a general way to describe the values that the function may take. Okay, so let's do an example. Let's say, just to think of an example, maybe let's just take a simple example function. Sum takes in two numbers, number 1 and number 2. It calculates the sum of these two numbers that are the parameters, and we just return sum. So this is the function definition. Define the function. And by the way, the syntax that I used right here, the double slashes, just mean that this is a comment. So this is how we define a comment in JavaScript. Comment generally means that this line won't be interpreted by the compiler. It's just here for us to just a way for us to document our code. So once we or when we return to our code, we know what we defined right here. So it will be just easier for us to define this function. We can also call this function, call the function sum. To call the function, we can just reference it by its name, so sum, and then we pass in the arguments, which are the actual values that will be used inside the function, so 2 and 3, for example. And we get the result, which is 5. So if we want to use this function maybe 3 times, we just have to use the name of that function 3 times. let's just do different values. It's basically a simple way for us to use this set of instructions. We don't have to each time redefine the same function or redefine the same set of instructions, since it wouldn't make sense. And that will be particularly helpful in case where the function actually has a complex logic behind it, so it will be just easier to reference the name of the function. Alright, so that's about it for functions. Just as a recap, like I said, a function is a way for us to bundle a set of instructions together that are usually used together. The structure of a function is we use the function keyword and then the name of the function. We define the number and the parameters that this function may take, and then we define the code block inside the function, which is the set of instruction, and then at the end we return the value. And once we when we want to use the function, we just have to call it by name and pass in the arguments. And of course, the number of arguments should be the same as the number of parameters in the declaration. Now we move on to arrays. So arrays is actually one of the first data structures that we will introduce. So a data structure is actually, as its name suggests, is just a way for us to structure our data in different formats. These formats depend on our use case. The array is one of the most simple data structures. It's effectively just a list that contains 0 or multiple values. In JavaScript, there is no particular distinctions about the values that an array may contain. So it could be strings or numbers, it doesn't really matter. For this example specifically, we have the first list, which is animals or array. It contains a list of strings, which are animals: cat, dog, cow, and horse. We have a list of decimals right here, and we can just normally console log a list of, and we will get this representation. So like I said, an array is a good way or a simple way for us to store our data. And we generally store elements in an array since, or if the case is that we will apply the same logic on those elements. Arrays are a particularly useful data structure, since in JavaScript the language actually offers us many methods into interacting with the arrays that may simplify the development process. So here I just picked some of these methods that we use the most. We have the find, so it searches for the first element that satisfies a condition. We have filter, that returns an array of elements that satisfy the condition. So the difference is that this one returns only the first element, and this one returns an array. We have push and pop to interact with our array, adding and removing elements. So we both add and remove elements at the end of the array. We have reverse, so it's concerned by the order of elements. We effectively reverse the elements in the array, meaning that the first element will be the last, and same thing goes for the elements in the middle. We also have sort. So sorting an array depends on the value inside the array. For example, in the array of animals, it will be sorted by the alphabetical order. For this one, it will be sorted by the standard arithmetic order. Finally, we have toString. It just converts the array into a string representation. Okay, so let's try some of these methods right here. So let's define an array. Let's use the same array earlier. So dog, cat. The syntax of the array is right here, and we have a comma between each element in the array. Also horse. Okay, so like I said, we can just print an array. and we get these elements. Let's try some of the previous examples. Let's try adding an element. For example, we do use the syntax of push, so animals dot push, and then let's just add, for example, a fish. Let's print the array once again. And as you can notice, we added the element at the end of the array. We can also remove an element by the method using the method pop. So the final element will be the element removed, but we can also at the same time get that the removed element. So to do that, let's just use another variable, removed element, and call the method on the array, animals.pop. So let's console the new array with the removed element, and let's print the removed element. And we get the reduced array and along with the element that we removed. So these are a few functions that the methods that are offered by JavaScript to interact with arrays. We can also, let's try maybe actually let's just keep this one. Let's try to sort the array by the alphabetical order. So console.log animals.sort. And we get the alphabetically ordered array. And as you can see, we have C and then D and then H. What we can also do is we revert the array. And we get effectively the reverse order of the elements from the original array. So these were a few examples that we used to interact with our arrays using the standard methods that are offered by JavaScript. We'll go back into using these methods in the final exercises that we'll use to try to compile on the knowledge that we got from the previous concepts. Now we move on to objects. So like I said earlier, so an object is just an element that contains multiple attributes. So it's not a variable, it's just like a primitive object in the sense that it only contains one attribute or one value. An object may contain multiple attributes. Each attribute has a value. For this example specifically, we have a customer. You may imagine that this is a customer in an e-commerce website or a normal supermarket. So we have the first name, John, we have the last name, Doe, and we have a cart. So the cart is just like the list of items that the customer is about to purchase. It's an array that contains these three elements: apple, orange, milk. So when we define the customer object in this way, it will be easier for us to access and interact and modify these values, since it's all bundled in one object. So it's easier for us to interact with a customer. So to read and modify object attributes, this is the syntax that we use. So it's pretty straightforward. We have customer.firstname, so we have the name of the object and then the name of the attribute. There's also this way of accessing an attribute, but you will find that we use this one the most. To modify a customer or to modify a value, we just use the same we just use the same syntax, so customer.cart, and then we assign to it an array that contains only one value, which is tomato. And when we console.log the array again, we get only when we console log the cart, we get only the new updated element, which is the new updated array, which is tomato. Yeah, so I think that's about it for objects. It's actually a simple concept that you will see that we use a lot. And the fact that we can read and modify the objects easily help us to use the objects more often. I think we've gone through all the concepts that we expected to see today. So finally, we'll just try to use these practice problems to see if we got a good grasp on the previously explained concepts. So I just have pretty simple examples right here. So the first one is write a function sum that takes in an array of numbers and returns their sum. So this is the first part of the question. It's pretty straightforward. We have an array, maybe array of numbers. Let's just take this example. We want to write a function that takes in an array of numbers and returns their sum. So first what we want to do is we define the function. So function sum, it will only take in as a parameter an array. So array. Inside the function, let's just think of the logic of how we can do this. I think it's pretty straightforward. We have an array. We want to get the sum of all elements in the array. So what we want to do first is we want to navigate through all the elements in the array. And each time we create a variable at the beginning. And each time get the sum of the previously counted elements plus the current element. And at the end, we just return the variable sum that we use to calculate the sum of all elements. So first we define a variable sum. It will be initialized to 0. To navigate through all the elements in the array, it's easy. You can just use a for loop, a standard for loop. So for let I equals to 0. Here in the exit condition, since we don't know the exact number of elements in the array, it may vary from parameter to parameter. We can use a method right here, which is length. So array.length effectively just give us the length of the array. It's a method in JavaScript that gives us the length of the array. The length of the array basically means the number of elements in that array. I++ to increment each time. And we do sum is the updated sum is the sum of previous elements. In the first one it will be 0 and the current element in the array. To access the current element in the array, we use the index since it's the moving part in our for loop. And to do that in an array, to access an element at a certain position, we do array of I. And then at the end we just return the sum. So I hope that makes sense. First we initialize a value sum. We loop through, sorry, right here it should be like this. We loop through the array. We initialize the index at 0. The exit condition will be once we reach the number of elements in that array. Each time we increment by 1. And the new sum will be the sum of the previously counted element plus the current element. And at the end we return the sum. So let's execute our function. Sum of numbers. And effectively we get the result 9. I guess what we can do is just to we can apply some abbreviations right here. So rather than us doing sum is equal to sum plus array of I, we can directly do like this. It basically means the same thing. It means that it will increment the sum by the value of the element at the position I of the array. It's just a syntax abbreviation. And we get the same result. So for the second part of the question, write a function mean that takes an array of numbers and returns their average. Mean must use the sum function. Okay, so a function mean that calculates the sum of, or actually sorry, the average of elements in the array using the sum function. Sorry, so it's actually quite easy. We did this example on purpose just to showcase that we can combine between multiple functions to get the desired result. So we can use a function inside a function, and we can use multiple you will find that a number program may, or actually usually involves using multiple functions in a combined fashion. So we have the sum function already defined. We want to calculate the average of the elements in an array. So the average is basically just the sum of all elements in the array divided by the number of elements in that array. So we define the function mean that takes in the array. We define the variable that will contain our result. We initialize to 0, and like I said, the mean is just the sum of elements in that array. To do that, we can directly use the sum function, and then we pass in the array. We divide that by the number of elements in that array. To get the number of elements in that array, it's actually pretty easy. We showcased it right here. It's just the length of that array, array.length. And then we return the mean. Okay. Let's just call it, let's call the mean function. Or actually, let's just to define it a little bit better. By the way, this is just a syntax to combine two results in the print statement. So this the string sum, and then the value generated by these two functions, and we get the correct result for the sum and the mean. So just to recap, we have the sum function. It's pretty straightforward. We have the syntax of declaring a function. It takes in an array as a parameter. We initialize the sum variable at 0. We do a standard loop. The loop will be executed. The number of iterations in the loop is the same number of elements in that array. So each time we increment the sum by the current value in the array, and then we return the result. For the second function, which is the mean function, we want to use the previous result of the sum function. Since it's basically the same thing, we don't need to repeat this code right here. So we just call it directly. The mean is calculated by doing the sum of all elements in the array, and we divide that by the number of elements in that array. And the result, and then we just return the result. So that's about it for our first example. For the second example, write a function even that takes an array and returns an array containing only even numbers from the original array. Alright, let's do that. So we have an array that contains multiple values. A number can only be even or odd. So we want to sorry, just gonna check again. Yeah, we only want to keep the even numbers in that array. So it just basically means that we want to remove the odd numbers. that's actually pretty straightforward. Let's do that. So we have a function that, let's call it even array, that takes in an array as a parameter. So effectively what we want to do is we want to loop through all the elements in that array. If an element is even, we just let it inside the, or we don't do anything, we pass to the next element. If it's odd, we remove it from that array. So we can do it in normally, like we defined earlier. We do a function for, and then we check, and each time if the number is, or actually let's just do it and then I'll show you a better way of doing it. So yeah, let's do a normal loop for each element in that array. So array.length plus. We can check if a number is even or odd. To do that is basically just we just have to check the remainder of the division of that number by 2. If it's 0, it's naturally an even number. If it's 1, it's an odd number. So if array of I, meaning the current element in that array, the remainder of that element divided by 2 is 1. So it's an odd number. We just remove it from the array. To remove an element from the array, actually we didn't see this one yet. So it's just a method that I did introduce earlier. So we just take the array and use a method called splice. This method takes in 2 parameters. So I is the position of the elements we want to remove. In our case, it's at the position I. And 1 is just the number of the elements that we want to remove starting from this position. In our case, it's just 1 element. And finally, we just return the result. We just return the array. So let's call this function. Let's just check the code again. So we have the array as a parameter. We loop through the array. Each time we check for the number. If it's odd, we remove it from the array. And then we just continue. And then we return the new updated array. Yeah, and actually this is the problem that I wanted to show you. If you can see right here, actually 5 is odd, but we kept it in the result array. Why this is, it's not actually really clear why, but I try to do my best to explain it. So when we remove an element, let's in this example for specifically, we let's just say that we move through this array. We reach the point at the element 3. We see that 3 is odd. We remove it. And when we remove it, we effectively, it's just like we are skipping 1 element. So we just directly move to 6. Since we are incrementing the I, but the array at the same time is shrinking. So we skip the 5 element. So it's actually like a tricky problem. I don't know if you get it. But my point here is that rather than doing all this logic and trying to come up with a solution to do that, actually we can do a solution is if we actually remove an element, we don't skip. Only if we find an even number, we can skip. To do that, we have to use a while loop. Actually, it will be a good chance for us to introduce the while loop, since we didn't. So let I equal 0. I'll explain it in a bit. So so this is the while loop. So the while loop operates in a similar fashion than a for loop. The difference is that we don't know the number of iterations we will do in a while loop. We just have the exit condition, and we change the value I so that it will be so that we will eventually reach the exit condition. It's used in cases where we don't know exactly how many times we will execute this code. here why it works because we only move to the next element if we don't remove a value. If we remove a value, we stay in that case. In the case of when we shrink the element, we just prevent it from skipping one element, in our case the 5. And now we get the correct result, which is 2, 6, 8, and those are all even numbers. So like you have seen in this example, we found like a tricky use case where this code wouldn't work. So rather than us doing all this logic and trying to come up with solutions that work for all use cases, we can directly use the methods that are predefined in JavaScript that are well tested, and we are sure we won't fall into problems when using these methods. So we saw a method that can be applied to this use case earlier. It's actually the filter method. The filter method just returns an array for all elements that satisfy that condition. So we can just apply the filter method on the even or odd function. To do that, we just do numbers.filter. This filter method actually takes in a function that takes in the number. I'm gonna explain it in a minute. So we have the number, and then we return divided by 2 is equal to 0. Okay, just gonna test to see if this works. Or actually, sorry, just have to remove this one. Number. Actually, this is not the expected behavior. So let's just change this one to. I think we have to define a new function. So yeah, and now we get the result, the expected result. So the reason it was not working is that, like we said earlier, right here, the filter method actually returns. It's right here. It returns an array. So we have to create a new variable to account for the newly created array. I'm just going to explain this syntax. So we applied the filter method. The filter method actually takes in a function. As you may notice, this function doesn't have a name. It has the same function structure without a name. It's called an anonymous function. Anonymous functions are used in one place. That's why we don't have to reference them by the name, since we will only be using them in this particular parameter. So it's just a function that will be used only one time. It takes in the number, and then we check for the condition that this basically means that if the number is even, it will return true. So this evaluates to an expression, true or false. If the number is even, it will evaluate to true, meaning that we will keep that element in the new filtered array. If it evaluates to false, meaning that this element is odd, we will remove it from the new array. And that way we get the expected result. So as you can see, using the predefined method in JavaScript will allow us to write shorter code, and at the same time account for all possible cases, so we won't fall into unexpected issues. I think we're almost finished. We just have one final problem. Yeah, so write a function remove element that takes a number and an array and removes all the occurrences of that element from the array. We actually can do it with the same. We just have to apply a slight changes into a slight change into this function, and it would work. Let's say, for example, we want to remove all the occurrences of 8. Just add in a few 8s right here. Okay, so we can also apply the filter function. To do that, we just have to check if the number is different from the number that we want to remove, which is 8. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. We can also define a function that will contain this code, but since I'm just gonna do it right now, we don't have to do it. And we get the new function that removes all the occurrences of 8. And that's the expected result. Once again, using the predefined functions allow us to write shorter code and to account for all use cases, so we won't have to worry about unexpected bugs. And alright, yeah, I think we are done for today. We covered a lot of subjects and concepts. I hope you understood and it was useful for you. Of course, stay tuned for upcoming workshops where we'll try to cover different subjects and try to go a little bit more advanced in this particular subject. So I think for now for the next one we'll try to do a little bit of DOM manipulations. So it's JavaScript on the front end. So yeah, stay tuned for that. Also, if you'd like to check Codelabs Academy, head over to codelabsacademy.com. And yeah, if you have any question or about the workshop or the program, you can leave it and we'll try to get back to you. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.